The question is, how you running?
All right, this week I have special guest Nick Howard with Poker Detox, and I was so excited to get a chance to talk with you, Nick. But before we get too far, I do have to ask, the first question is always, how you running?
I'd say good. I just had a newborn. Baby's perfectly healthy, so perfect run there. World Series was overlapping it, so it was a busy time for me. Um, we staked 9 players in the main event.
Okay,
All 9 busted before cashing, so not a good run there.
right.
Uh, but I managed to actually make day 5 for the second time in 2 years, so that was a good run for me. I mean, it always is painful to go out that late, and there's no trophies for it. But overall, I felt really good about the way the summer went, and there's a new baby in the house now, so
Yeah.
everybody's just getting adjusted.
Congratulations to you for that, and to your wife. It sounds like everybody came out healthy and good. So glad to hear that. So let's jump into Poker Detox, because I told you before we jumped on, had been looking at Poker Detox a lot before we were able to touch base with each other, and fascinated with the approach that you guys have. So tell everybody about Poker Detox and how that's different.
Sure. First off, thanks for having me on and being interested enough in the newsletter to sync up with me. It's probably easiest if I give you the context of my own experience as early as 2015, when detox really started to form as an idea or vision. At that time, I was at the tail end of a 10-year career as a poker player, and I was coaching for Run It Once as an elite coach. That's usually the first place people have found my content if you've been around that long. And that was a time where the solvers had just come out, and I was at I was in a real pickle, in the sense that I was making training content for that site, and a lot of what we were doing was theory based. But I felt I had just a really strong sense that we were not helping the community in the way that we thought we were. The type of content we were putting out just broke down in practice. It was very strong in a theoretical sense, but transferring it to the table just left me feeling like there was a lot to be desired still from a training methodology. So this bothered me to the point where I ended up resigning from Run It Once, and I was very open about my reasons for sort of departing from mainstream poker. I really bunkered myself in after that period, and it was just a lot of reflecting on, if I'm going to continue with this career, what would I need in order to feel safe? Kept coming back to that word, safe or secure, because I left, you know, a college degree to do this, and I did it on the assumption that it was going to be a reliable path. So having that assumption challenged later in my 20s really caused me a lot of dissonance, and it was really destroying my confidence as a person. So what I realized through that reflection period was that I was going to need a stable decision making process that I could use for every hand I played, in a way that would give me the same answer every time. Meaning, if I showed you a hand every day for the next 15 days and you were using a stable system, you would get the same answer. And I knew that that just wasn't happening, for me up until that point. My decisions were affected by mood. I had cognitive biases all over the place that would cause me to just uh, start guessing in hands based on whatever thought came to mind. So that was helpful in the sense that I knew what I needed at that point. And I also knew my limitations. I knew I wasn't a software expert, but I knew we were going to need data. In order for us to be able to make reliable decisions, we needed more vision over um, what accurate decision making frameworks would look like. We needed the inputs for those equations, and they needed to be practical. So I stumbled upon a method where we could use solvers, compare them to population analysis after getting data from real online games and map the imbalance of the market. And by mapping an imbalance, you simultaneously optimize for both accuracy and simplicity. Because if I know someone's leaning left, I go right. It's not this very complex multiple bet size mixed strategy option that you encounter so much when you're using solver work. That is the theory landscape. What we were able to do is basically expose the map of the real world. And through that process, uh, we began to guide players towards a more exploitative framework for sure, because we're following the incentives of market imbalances, but in a way that produces more profit and also simplifies the execution of it.
You're talking about it being exploitative, but it's interesting to me because it's exploitative but using data to be exploitive, which goes against how people think about it. So I would love it if you could go down that road a little bit further as well.
So theory and exploits cannot be separated. Not actually. It's the, cognitive mistake that people make when they're not really well versed in how these strategies form. But you cannot really know what a exploitative maneuver is without also having a peripheral sense of where the equilibrium would be. So in
Right.
that sense, they are two sides of the same coin. You need to know what a theoretical baseline is before you could even identify that you're doing something exploitative on one side or the other. So, excuse me, our strategy is really the foundational concept is that you understand this equity threshold, as we call it. That is the threshold beyond which, if someone deviates one way or the other, there is an immediate exploit available. That could look like if someone's folding too much, now we bluff them too much.
Right.
If someone's not folding enough, now we won't bluff them at all. If someone is bluffing too much, now we call them with every single bluff catcher in our hand that doesn't lose to one of their bluffs, and vice versa. If they're
Right.
not bluffing enough, we would just fold all of our bluff catchers. You would be surprised how many poker players were never even introduced to a framework as principled as that. But that is, in my brother's eyes, who was the initial strategy developer of the course during the stage where we created the first data-driven prototype. He believes this is the most foundational concept a poker player needs to understand in order to excel, and I fully agree with that.
So, how does the process look when you are taking somebody and really having to completely change that mindset to start thinking about things from a data driven mindset?
The first thing that we do differently now as opposed to previously is we wait longer before we onboard them privately for longer term training. Introducing our 30-day training camp was a big leg up in this department because it was the first time where we really gave people a fully guaranteed zero risk way to try the data driven strategy out without having to make any type of commitment yet. So normally what I say, when people are interested in a data driven path is you should just look at the lessons that we offer in the 30-day training camp. If it's for you, it's a big win in the sense that now you have a clear path forward to high stakes. If you get to the 2 week mark and you're like, this isn't up my alley, just refund the product. And now you are on an instinctual path. You're someone who belongs on a more instinctual path. I use those two forks to describe the two main paths that you can take to high stakes. You are either going to take a data driven path or an instinctual path, whether you're aware of that or not. I feel like there should just be more awareness raised around those two paths in the industry. And so that's the framework I try to speak through when I'm assessing the risks of instinctual or data driven paths. In that same vein, I try to express poker as a business to people who haven't really thought about it as a startup model. If you are a poker player, whether or not you realize it, you are an entrepreneur who is starting a business at zero with your starting bankroll, and you are attempting to have an outside return of 100 or 1000x. If you use intelligent business frameworks to map that process, what you will see is that the most important thing that you can optimize for upfront is that you select a strategy that gives you the highest likelihood of getting from 0 to say 20, where we could call 20 high stakes. maximizing the likelihood that you get from 0 to 20 means that when you're at 20, now compound returns start kicking in much faster. High stakes is where all the money is made. So the guy who gets there the fastest wins in terms of the compound gain. And people are not used to thinking about it like this because, for one, I don't think they're used to thinking in terms of a business mindset when approaching their career, but also no one's really raised awareness around these two paths. The instinctual path will statistically fail you at a larger probability than a data-driven path. Basically, just because a data-driven path is proven, the only risk here is the executionary risk. Can you follow the steps?
Right.
With an instinctual path, you have a lot of additional risks. Like, is your judgment off? And this is where it's really hard to communicate with people who are convinced that they have strong instincts. Circling back, to answer your question full on, I don't train people who think that they have strong instincts when they've been stuck at small stakes for a significant amount of time. That was the adjustment, because I just have no interest in fighting that battle with someone's ego if they haven't already been able to get past that first point of maturity.
Right. And so one thing that we talked about before we jumped on here was the data versus instincts, and how the way that we compared that to sports as a whole, right? And data being used in every sport. And so when we apply that to poker, it's really not a new concept. It's a concept that's been there forever. It's just people never realized that's actually what they were doing, right?
They never realized it could apply here, maybe. It's interesting because if you look at sports, like, just to give the audience some examples of this, you've got that movie Moneyball, which was a documentary around the Oakland A's, who built an extremely undervalued roster just by looking into the data and seeing who were the players that got on base most. And then they found that those guys were not being valued enough, and they recruited them. You've got stuff in football, like people go for fourth and short way more frequently than they used to, because the data said that the conversion rates just make sense. Soccer, we have, data chips being embedded into jerseys so that we can more accurately assess game footage at the end. This is happening in every single major performance arena outside of poker. But the interesting thing is that it is also already widely accepted in every other industry. So it's not just that it's happening, it's mainstream. You don't have that in poker. Not yet, at least. I would say the clear majority of professional poker players are still not highly available to data-driven strategies. It might be on their radar, but when it comes down to compatibility with data, and by that I mean, like, are you willing to execute in alignment with it and be held accountable to it? You don't see that same level of diligence in the poker community. And that's not good or bad, it's just sort of where we are right now. But it is surprising that we are probably 20 years behind other major sports industries.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's true. One thing that they do talk about in a sports world with the data is burnout. So, how do you think we could avoid that, with, especially because with poker, you can get lost studying, right? You can study for hours and hours and hours. How do you avoid a burnout with the focus being on data?
The best thing you can do is find a way to gamify the curriculum. So a lot of what we do on the UX side, which is really where I've spent most of my time in the last 18 months, is constantly getting feedback from the users who are going through training, the new players who are ascending from training to Division 1 to Division 2, exploring what kinks they encountered in the curriculum along the way. And that could be something like the information was not displayed in a way that fit their learning type, or it could be that they wanted more deliberate feedback over each module in the form of a quiz. And this is something that we begin begun to implement in terms of KPI reports, which are really the future, I think, of data-driven poker training. In order for a education service to legitimize itself, there needs to be non-sensationalized client success metrics that are posted after every graduate class. This is how Harvard does it. This is how every reputable education business presents their data. They don't post little 20,000 hand graphs of the student who just had a good month. They just show you, here was the last graduating class, here's how they did. And what they'll also show you is, and here's what these guys scored on their tests along the way. So that when you're looking at that college, if you're, scanning your options, you can be making your bet based on how the last graduating class performed. And I really like that approach because I just think it's very stable, it's very transparent, and it puts the onus on the prospect to decide if they want to gamble on that company. So to answer your question, in the light of how to prevent burnout, I think we keep the player engaged through actionable feedback, measurable feedback with these quizzes and KPI reports, because I do believe something about having data-driven feedback around your play, although that might seem like the study portion of it can be monotonous at times, it's really awesome to know exactly where you're landing in terms of hitting your targets or not. So when you give someone a database report, for instance, which we do for our players every 100,000 hands, it's a statistically significant sample size where we can say, here's your report, here's all major nodes, you're either hitting your targets in them or not, and we'll show you exactly the ones where you're off. Now that player has delivered to them on a silver platter all of the areas where they're missing their targets, and they can go repeat those steps over the next 100,000 hands to try to improve and get closer to those targets. There's something about that that's attractive and gamified in the sense that now they actually are focused on what they need to be doing. So I think it's this interplay between studying data and making it fun. Time release lessons is something that we started to explore, where it's like a daily drip. You wake up, you get a new lesson. Just stuff like that actually makes it stimulating. And then the other side of it is like, once you get your report, now you have actionable instructions and you get to challenge yourself. Can I get closer next time? Coming at it from both of those angles, I think, is really what solves the burnout.
That makes perfect sense. And then if you kind of solve the burnout side of it, then the data then leads to more quote unquote aha moments, right? So you kind of start to realize where you're making your mistakes, or where you need to improve your game, so to speak.
The results start coming too, which is the boost of confidence.
Right.
I think Magnus Carlsen said, when they asked him about this progression in his own career, like, when did he really get motivated? He said something like, the appetite came with the meal. I think he was talking about something similar here, where like when you start to get results, it's that moment when it's like, wow, my ceiling might actually be way higher than I thought. Let's actually go for this now, full on. One thing I'll add about the private team to prevent burnout is we implemented a quarterly cut where we actually cut the bottom 10% of the team every quarter. Difficult to do that in an industry where the feedback loops are longer than any other performance arena in the world. So we can't just make that assessment based on their results over the quarter. We need the KPI reports to be able to say, and you're not doing well in your quizzes, and you're not playing enough hands, and you're not showing up to the accountability calls, and you're not posting in the Discord channels and asking questions about hands. We pull from a lot of different angles, including culture, your cultural score, and just overall how kind you are to the other members on the team. That's just a huge one, in order to decide who makes the cut every quarter and who doesn't. So knowing that that's coming, you would expect it puts like this anxious pressure on people, and there is a little bit of that. But what we've noticed every single time a cut happens is that the players who make it through the cut become closer and more connected, because
Right.
there's a sense of loyalty that's developing to both the coaching team and the player team, that like, we've made it through these cuts. we represent something in terms of our core values that's different, just fundamentally different from the people who did get cut. And for us, those values are radical candor, radical accountability, and pursuit of excellence, endless pursuit of excellence.
That makes sense. And I would assume that if you make the cut, time and time again, then that's a boost to confidence as well, which also it's kind of a loop,
Self-amplifying feedback loop. Yeah.
So yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. I feel like I could go on forever with all of this, but I do need to wrap up. So let me just ask you, how can people then reach out to you and get involved with Poker
Sure.
Detox?
You'll see our stuff popping up on Twitter if you follow either Poker Detox or myself. That's where I'm probably most persistent with posting. Check us out on Instagram, Poker Detox. Other than that, our newsletter. You can plug into it through any of our platforms. That's how you found us, I think, Joe. And it's probably the most, it's a dense drip of free content that really builds your context around a data-driven strategy, how it works, what it sounds like to use it in a hand, which I think is the question that a lot of people have. And also, it'll give you more frameworks for what the high stakes journey looks like at every step along the way when using a data-driven framework. So my goal with it was basically to just fill in as many knowledge gaps as possible about how this career progresses. What are the skill stacks that you need at every single stage, and how does that eventually lead you to being able to make $250,000 a year or more as a professional poker player? So check us out on any of those social media platforms. You'll see posts where you can plug directly into the newsletter. Then you'll have a daily drip. That's the best way.
Yeah, perfect. And we'll have links at the bottom in the description of the podcast as well for everybody to click on. But Nick, I really appreciate you being here. Like I said, I think you and I could probably delve into a lot of this for hours, but yeah, we'll hopefully maybe get you back on again another time.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.